Kyle Maynard was born without hands or feet. It was from a condition called amniotic band syndrome, where fibrous bands of tissue build up in the amniotic sac and constrict the limbs of the developing baby. And the resulting amputation of Kyle's limbs at different levels occurred during the pregnancy. Now, his parents focused on helping Kyle develop skills to overcome his challenges. And when he was 2 years old, his dad decided that everyone should stop feeding Kyle. After all, one day he would need to live on his own. So Kyle learned to feed himself with a prosthetic spoon and then a fork and a knife, and it gave him his first sense of independence. Growing up brought challenges for Kyle at school, where the other kids treated him in ways that made him very aware of his disabilities. This brought on feelings of doubt as to his future, whether he would be able to live independently someday, whether he could ever have a girlfriend or get married. And these were hopeless times for him in elementary school, as the world around him made him feel defective. But things changed for Kyle in middle school when he started playing football. He made his first tackle on the football field at age 11. And although that single successful tackle didn't change everything, it gave Kyle a sense of potential, of possibility, of hope, and of control of his future. He started to believe he could achieve. And of course, everyone he played against in football had normal bodies, 2 arms and 2 legs. And at first he struggled to make it on the field, but he committed himself to learning how to be an unbeatable defensive lineman. And with very good coach and a lot of training, Kyle turned his compact size into a weapon. And the other team's offensive linemen couldn't get low enough to block him. In high school, he took up wrestling. But after losing his first 35 matches, he wanted to give up. You see, Kyle's opponents would simply hold his head down on the mat, and he couldn't reach them with his short upper arms. But another amazing man, coach, taught Kyle how to use his strength to do moves his opponents had never seen, and he used his body as a psychological advantage. Kyle began to experience success on the wrestling match, eventually finishing 12th in his weight class in the National High School Wrestling Championships. Kyle's grandmother was also a big part of his life. She taught him many wise things about resilience as he grew up, and one of the things that he remembers is when she told him, "Kyle, when you shake someone's hand, your disability will go away." So today, Kyle continues to do things most of us would consider impossible. For instance, he was the first person in history to crawl up Mount Kilimanjaro. This amazing feat manifested the resilience that Kyle possesses and suggested some lessons for all of us. And after he reached the summit, he said, "All I could see was the dirt in front of me. I have a thought about what keeps me going in the face of obstacles. Instead of thinking about the ultimate goal, I focus on the immediate future. When I'm climbing a mountain, I'm down on all fours looking at the ground. It's not going to do me any good to look at the summit. I just figure out how to do the best I can with the next few feet in front of me." Kyle is now an entrepreneur, a motivational speaker, a best-selling author with his book, No Excuses, and he's an extreme athlete. Kyle definitely has disabilities, but Kyle has had people around him who have played critical roles in becoming the resilient person that he is. Well, good morning, San Antonio. We are in the Alamo City, the River City, and as I call it, the Tone. Does anybody call it the Tone? No? and thank you, Penn, for your kind, nobody calls it the Tone? Well, I call it the Tone, okay? And thank you, Penn, for your kind introduction. It is an honor to be with you this morning and share some thoughts about resilience in parenting. And I bring greetings from Tucson, Arizona, home of the Arizona Wildcats. And really, nice. And many creepy, crawly desert animals, including scorpions, tarantulas, and rattlesnakes in your garage. This 4-foot cuddle monster we named Pookie. Well, at the University of Arizona, I have the pleasure of training the next generation of baby doctors, and my passion is around parenting. I love to observe parenting, I love to study parents. I love to coach parents, and I like to wake up parents when they have it wrong, and I love to enthusiastically cheer them on when they're getting it. You know, parenting is the hardest job anyone could ever love, and it will give you lots of gray hair, case in point. And we now know, did you know through research, that gray hair is a hereditary thing? You get it from your kids. So I was born and raised in northern Minnesota. Anybody from northern Minnesota? Nice. She's got that little Norwegian woo! And I want you to know it was cold, wasn't it? Oh yeah, and I mean cold. Our long and frigid winters challenged us in many ways, so we consider ourselves in northern Minnesota weather-resilient people. And we Scandinavians, you know, are very hardy stock. The women are strong, the men are good-looking, and all the kids are above average. But not only did 30 below make us more resilient, you find a lot of older Minnesota couples around who have been married a very long time, and it's probably related to the need to keep each other warm. But it reminds me of a story of the proverbial northern Minnesota Norwegian couple, Ole and Lena. They are pictured here as they were about to celebrate their 75th wedding anniversary. A local newspaper reporter came to do a story on their long marital bliss and relational resilience. And he interviewed Ole, who offered the following story. He said, "Well, you know," I'm going to go into my Norwegian dialect here. "Well, you know, 75 years ago, Lena and I went on our honeymoon to the Grand Canyon. We were taking a horse ride down the cliff trail, and Lena's horse slipped, and she looked at her horse and said, 'That's one.' We kept going, and her horse lost his footing again, and she almost fell off the horse, and she looked at the horse and said, 'That's two.' Well, about 50 yards later, Lena's horse tripped, and Lena fell off her horse. She went over, pulled out the trail guide's rifle, and shot the horse dead. So I said, 'What are you doing, Lena? You shouldn't have shot that horse.' To which she turned to me and said, 'That's one.'" That may be the first example of 1, 2, 3 magic in history. Well, most of us in this room know that resilience is one of the most needed and valuable traits a person can have. And this morning, I want to present some information about life truths, what research says about the 4 key ingredients for resilience, a little bit about attachment and parental responsiveness, a little bit about parenting that fosters and hinders resilience, and then leave you with some messages that you can share with the kids and the parents with which you work that will be messages of resilience. You know, I sometimes scratch my head when I work with kids, and I'm sure you're all in the same boat, that we've all been given all the advantages and opportunities imaginable, not to mention their natural abilities and talents. And they end up with so little resilience. And then I see kids, despite having really most of life's odds against them, grow up and develop to be amazingly resilient. And they live effective lives. So what are the common threads in a child's life that hinders becoming a resilient person? And what are the common threads that foster resilience? We'll get to that in a little bit, but first I want to start with this question. Why is resilience so important? Resilience is the product of a person who embraces 2 sentinel truths about our human condition. The first truth is this: life is difficult. Raise your hand if you have found life to be more difficult than you thought it would be. Exactly. The response is universal every time I pose it. Life is difficult. Yes, it is. Experiencing hardship, living through disappointment, having your world rocked by circumstances, this is life, and it is difficult. It's a universal experience for every human being, but it's a sentinel truth that many parents keep secret from their kids, hoping that if their child believes that life isn't difficult, it will somehow become a self-fulfilling prophecy. And you see, resilience requires both an understanding and an acceptance that life will be difficult. And whether you're in the British royal family, whether you're an oppressed Uyghur person in Western China, whether you're a kid with your mom in inner-city LA slums, and whether you're a suburban child playing soccer in Terrell Hills, we are all in the same boat, one way or another, we all will eventually experience that life is hard. Now, sometimes life goes well for a kid. We all get to have those times, don't we, when things are pretty stable, relationships are good, our expectations are being met, life is going well, but not forever. People get cancer. Your family moves away from all your friends. Your parents get separated. A sibling becomes a drug addict. It's inevitable, and this is a message we must encourage parents to communicate with their kids, that life is difficult. And not in a Debbie Downer kind of way, but in a reality-based and age-appropriate way. And for kids who have not been taught or allowed to experience that life will, at least at times, be difficult, resilience will be evasive or absent. Things like a flat tire, a lost phone, losing a final paper when your computer crashes, having a sleepover canceled, these things will become overwhelming to a non-resilient child. Maybe life deals a child some really bad cards, adversities that seem insurmountable, neglect or abuse, chemical dependency, mental illness, parental discord, domestic violence. All of these things Colleen Bridger will unpack tomorrow as she addresses the impact of adverse childhood experiences. But for kids growing up in this type of chaos, resilience may be the only thing that will determine a different path for their lives, a path away from family discord and dysfunction. And in both scenarios, there must be at least one important person or people who come into the life of the child and make the difference. I once knew a young man who was 14 years old, and life had dealt him some pretty bad cards. Growing up, he experienced constant parental fighting. Occasionally, he witnessed violence between his parents. They were both alcoholics, and his mother had severe bipolar depression, which was the major factor in her suicide. He did remember some positive parts to his mom when he was a really young child, but that changed when he entered middle school as her depression and alcoholism began to consume her life. In himself being on the receiving end of emotional and occasional physical abuse, this young man accumulated an ACE score of 6. No one on the outside knew anything. Just a few family members knew, but it was never talked about or help was never sought. And this young man fortunately had some key non-parent adults who came into his life and who modeled what it looked like to be a loving father, a devoted husband, an effective person. And they all took time to invest in the boy. His best friend's dad modeled for him how a father treats his children with fairness, justice, and calm. And this young man watched. His high school choir director lived out a marriage that was all in and committed. And this young man watched. His family doctor, knowing some of the sensitive details of his family, invested time and energy to become his greatest role model, one who compassionately served his patients and went the extra mile to make a difference. So these 3 men became this young man's social, emotional buffers, even though they didn't know it at the time. And at 16 years of age, this young man looked in the mirror and said, "I will not live my life this way. I will go a different path." And from that day forward, he looked back with encouragement from his family physician and dedicated himself to learning as much as he could about healthy relationships through counseling and about boundaries with his family's chemical dependency through Alateen and Al-Anon. And he made it his mission not to repeat the generations of dysfunction. I tell you this story because when life dealt me these cards, all was not lost. Social emotional buffers can be a teacher, co-teachers, aunt or uncle, a friend's parent, a mentor, a coach in Kyle Maynard's case, therapists, grandparent, but preferably we want it to be the parent. But when parents and families are unwilling or unable or incapable of supplying a safe and secure attachment for that child, there are others that can be what that child needs. The second sentinel truth is you are not that special. No. Before you gaffe at hearing this, let me explain what I mean. In the last 30 years, we, my generation, have done a disservice to the millennial, the Gen Y, and the Gen Z generations. "You are special" has been plastered on kindergarten hallways in most schools for decades, and it dominates Pinterest today. It's not that the message is necessarily a bad message. It just gets overused. How many young people do you know who are not happy with who they are, desperately wanting to be somebody different, someone special, but they don't feel special? Kids grow up bathed in this message that tells them they're special. It's been overused and taken out of context, and being special today has morphed into something that isn't what Mr. Rogers intended. And closely connected to this message is one that says you can be anything you want to be. How many times have you heard that? I believe this is a dangerous thing to say because it can set up a kid for failure. Not all children become engineers. Not all children are great artists or athletes. In fact, some kids probably should not go to college. You can be anything you want to be assumes a posture of linear thinking that over-focuses on someone else's plan for a child's destiny rather than their own journey. So special kids grow up thinking they will somehow have an easier time achieving their goals than those who are average, and this is not true. A few comments about being average. First, what's wrong with being average? Nothing, absolutely nothing is wrong with being average. The truth is that most of us in this room are average. And most of our clients and patients are average. And most of our kids are average. I'm average. Are you? I'm average and proud of it. In fact, I'm an average athlete, slightly above average in math and science, slightly below, well, definitely below average in art. I think I'm above average in golf, at least I have that perception. I'm definitely below average in regular exercise. And I used to be slightly above average in being judgmental. But over time, I've learned to be above average in compassion and empathy. My point is that we are all a composite of average, above average, and below average, but rarely gifted and exceptional. I would suggest that the words gifted and exceptional rarely be used because they are rare. Bottom line, none of us are that special. None of us are defined by our giftedness or exceptionality. Most of us are simply average people trying to do a good job at life. I want everyone to stand up, and I want you to turn to the person next to you and look in their eyes and say, I am average. Good. And now, don't sit down. Now I want you to look in their eyes and say, isn't it wonderful? You may be seated.